Hey everyone, Auntie Rara here with a story time. This story is called The Invisible Boy by Trudy Ludwig, illustrated by Patrice Barton. Can you see Brian, the invisible boy? Even Mrs. Carlotti has trouble noticing him in her classroom. She's too busy dealing with Nathan and Sophie. Nathan has problems with what Mrs. Carlotti calls volume control. He uses his outside voice inside too much. Sophie whines and complains when she doesn't get her way. Nathan and Sophie take up a lot of space. Brian doesn't. Taking up space, we don't mean that Brian is small. We just mean his energy doesn't really take up a lot of space, like Nathan and Sophie. When the bell rings for recess, Micah and JT take turns choosing kids for their kickball teams. The best players get picked first, then the best friends of the best players, then the friends of the best friends. Only Brian is left, still waiting and hoping. His little face in this picture just breaks my heart. JT glances in Brian's direction and just as quickly looks away, like, "We've got enough players for each team," he tells the others. "Let's play ball." My son points out in this picture that there's actually one extra kid on the other team, so Brian could have actually joined that team. In the cafeteria, Madison and her friends talk about her birthday party. "The rope swing over the pool was awesome," says JT. "Yeah, so was the water slide," adds Fiona. "That was the best pool party ever." "I'm so glad you guys had fun," says Madison. Everyone did except Brian. He wasn't invited. Sometimes you can't invite everybody to your party, but if you can't, then you shouldn't talk about it in front of the people who weren't invited. At choosing time, while the other kids played board games and read, Brian sits at his table doing what he loves to do best. He draws fire-breathing dragons scaling tall buildings, space aliens locked in intergalactic battles, greedy pirates digging for treasure, and superheroes with the power to make friends wherever they go. Little dragon, "Thank you for toasting my marshmallow." On Monday morning, Mrs. Carlotti introduces Justin, a new student to the class. Brian smiles shyly at him. Some of the other kids sneak looks at Justin, trying to figure out if he's cool enough to be their friend. They haven't quite made up their minds yet. I was a new kid a lot, and it was true that a lot of the more popular kids always kind of scurry to the front to be friends with the new kid. At lunch, Madison and JT watched Justin eat with chopsticks. "What's that?" asked Madison as she points at Justin's food. "It's bulgogi." What?" "Bulgogi. It's Korean barbecued beef. My grandma made it for me. It's really good. Do you want to try some?" "There's no way I'd eat booger-G." And the kids laugh. All of them, that is, except Brian. He sits there wondering which is worse, being laughed at or feeling invisible. Think about that. Would you rather be laughed at, or would you rather be invisible? They both feel pretty crummy. The next day, when Justin goes to his cubby to put away his backpack, he notices a piece of paper with his name on it. "Justin, I thought the bulgogi looked good, Brian." He left him a little note with a picture. Bulgogi is actually kind of sweet. It's like a sweet barbecue, like shredded beef. At morning recess, Brian finds a piece of chalk on the ground and starts drawing away. "You're Brian, right?" "Yeah. Thanks for the note." "Hey, Justin," Emilio calls from the tetherball court. "You're up next." "Sorry, gotta go," says Justin. "By the way, that's a really cool drawing," he adds before taking off. So I want you to notice in the picture, my son actually pointed this out. Brian has been black and white in most of the story, but when the new kid, Justin, talks to him, he's getting a little bit of color. He's becoming a little less invisible. Back in class, Mrs. Carlotti asked the kids to team up in 2s or 3s for a special project. The kids scurry around the room to pair off. Brian heads towards Justin. "I'm already with Justin," says Emilio. "Find someone else." Brian looks at the floor, wishing he could draw a hole right there to swallow him up. "Mrs. Carlotti said we could have up to 3 people in our group. We're only 2. Come on, Emilio, let him work with us." "Okay, I guess." So Justin is letting Brian join their group. Mrs. Carlotti gives the class directions for a project. Your assignment is to work together to write a story about what you see in that photograph. Use your imagination and have fun. "Whoa, cool," says Emilio. "What kind of people do you think would live in houses like that?" "I don't know, but I bet Brian could draw them to go with our story," says Justin. Brian smiles as he takes out his lucky pen. And look, he's in color now. In this picture, there's not a lot of words, so you can just see what they're doing. They're working together, they're drawing together, they're creating together, and then they're presenting together with silly hats and pictures, things that Brian helped them create. It's lunchtime again, Brian's least favorite part of the day, probably because he feels so left out. Another 20 long minutes of kids talking and laughing with everyone but him. "Brian," he hears someone shout. "Hey, Brian, over here." Brian turns and sees Justin waving him over. Emilio nods at Brian as he makes room for him at the table. "Cookie? Thanks." Maybe, just maybe, Brian's not so invisible after all. I'm gonna say something that me and my cousins, whenever there's something really cute, we just go, "Aww." This is a "aww" story. So again, ask yourself, what's worse, being invisible or being laughed at? And they're both pretty crummy. So we want to make sure people don't feel invisible and aren't laughed at, and stand up for those kids and help kids feel included, you know. And I tell my students and my children that you don't have to be friends with everyone, but you should be friendly to everyone. You never know what people are going through. And another thing that I tell my students and my children are hurt people, which means if somebody's hurting, they kind of hurt other people too, maybe with their words, maybe with their fists or bodies. But when somebody is being hurtful, it's usually because they're hurting and they need help. So I hope that you learned a lot from that story, The Invisible Boy, and I'll see you later.